Welcome back, folks. It's the Fantasy Slant powered by Pro Football Focus. And I'm your host, Jeff Ratcliffe, back for another week of IDP talk. Yes, we are talking IDP, and it's early July, but we can never get enough football. And by we, of course, I mean me and my co-host, Ross Miles. Ross, what's going on this week, man?
Not too much. Just wraps up a rookie draft in my big money fantasy league, and I'm just kind of just getting my head down, getting ready for some redraft. You know, it's never too early to start building some draft boards and looking at your rosters and working out who's cuttable and who you want to pick up this coming year. So just kind of working through that in all the leagues we play in. Really, that's what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to minimize leagues. Every time I talk, that's one of the big questions people ask, how many leagues you in? And I know, what was it, like a year or two ago, we were on a show, and I mentioned I think I was in over 30 leagues or something crazy like that at that time. And, people are like, how do you do it? I mean, I said if you can do four, you can do 30. But that doesn't mean you want to do 30, so I've actually scaled back pretty significantly. Had two rookie drafts this year, have one more coming up in the three major dynasty leagues I'm in. And that's it. And I'm cool with that, right? Absolutely cool with just doing the analysis and all that. But leagues are still fun, and leagues of all varieties. And, we're about to get into the thick of things, and it's not exactly the best time for news, but there still is a little bit of news, Ross, so let's get into it right now. It's the news. Yes, that's production, Ross. Production on the news. You gotta love it. All right, let's start down in Miami here, where Deion Jordan was suspended for the first 4 games of the season for performance-enhancing drugs. We don't exactly know the details of what he was popped for, but there were reports earlier this offseason that he had bulked up. Now, Ross, Jordan is a favorite of mine. I think that he's in an unfortunate landing spot with Cameron Wake and the emergence of Olivier Vernon ahead of him, but I still like Jordan to be a potential breakout. Now, I want to just get your general thoughts about this. Obviously, this pushes him pretty far down draft boards. You're going to have to sit on him for 4 weeks. But what are your thoughts on Jordan as a player? What are your expectations for him in 2014?
So Jordan's a player who I find really interesting, mainly because when he came out last year, he was highly, highly touted by quite a few people. And what I saw, it wasn't for me. It was, I thought he was quite narrow. I didn't quite see that, but I know he's painted as this excellent edge rusher, but I just didn't quite see what I wanted on tape. And I had him quite low down my rookie board, so I didn't get him in any leagues. Then obviously the landing spot didn't help either. But now, like you say, I was marking him down as a little bit of a sleeper because of such a disappointing first year of his injury, which really restricted him in minicamp, training camp, so he didn't really get on the field enough. I thought that his value had tipped so far to the point where he now offered some value because there was so much buzz around him, and he does have that pass rush skill set that I was like, well, although he's not my favourite player of all time, you can't turn away from good value. If you're picking him up as your DE4, or D5 on your roster, you can plug him in as a bye-week replacement. If he actually hits, you're good. But like you say, that the 4-game suspension, this kind of worries me because it was such a down first year. It sort of smells a little bit like this could be a bust. I want to be positive about Jordan, but like I said, my initial opinion was relatively tainted on him, so I'm not sure with this 4-game suspension. I just don't see much value in him this year. I think he's going to struggle to get on the field anyway with Vernon and Wake there in front of him. So it's a difficult one. I sound like I'm sitting on the fence. In one hand, I'm saying I like him. On the other, saying I don't. So yeah, I am a bit of a fence sitter on Jordan, I'm afraid, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can exactly label that first year as a down year per se. I mean, he didn't play a lot of snaps. That's just the simple fact. 339 defensive snaps on the season. And, what I really like about Jordan, what really kind of gets me going from an IDP standpoint, is his ability in coverage. For his size, he's a massive man. And for his ability to move at 6'6", 260, it's just, it's kind of jaw-dropping. And we see similar players like this. We see Jamie Collins, a player who is big, He can rush the passer, but he can also drop back and looks as equally as comfortable in coverage. We see that with Jordan, and that's what he offers that Vernon doesn't offer, that Cameron Wake doesn't offer. And yeah, sure, maybe he's not going to match Cameron Wake's skill as a pass rusher, but maybe he doesn't need to be a valuable fantasy asset. We see this every year. We see players early in the season, and boy, I cringe when I go back and read what I write at this time of year last year, what I wrote this time of year 2 years ago, because, again, we're predicting the weather sometimes, and sometimes we're way off, or we could see, the radar says the hurricane's coming, but we just miss it, and Jordan's a guy who I don't want to miss on. I don't want him to blow up and me not get my hands on this guy. So, hey, he might go undrafted, but as Ross would say, it's a cheeky play if you get in there week 2 or week 3 and you pick him up before he comes back. And still, you might have to sit on him for 4 more weeks before you get anything out of him. But I think the storm clouds are certainly brewing for Jordan. So, Ross, we're in a bit of disagreement here.
Well, I think that I would grab him right at the end of drafts, just as that depth guy. Maybe, like you say, because of I think he was going there anyway, so maybe with the suspension he is going to go undrafted. I would not be surprised if he goes undrafted, if I pick him up at the end of week 2 in nearly every IDP league, just to take that flyer, because, like you said, the boom is so much, there's so much potential for the boom, and that's what wins you fantasy leagues, that guy that you pick up off the waiver wire that turns into a D1 or an LB1.
Yeah, look at it last year. Where did we rank Carlos Dansby? I couldn't even tell you, but I know it was not where he finished. And a number of people struck gold. You're catching that proverbial lightning in a bottle with a guy like that. And you really do have to be ahead of the curve. If you go by if you're one of those fantasy owners, if you're listening to this show, your chances are you're not one of those fantasy owners. But who goes by last year's stats, you're not winning you're never going to win. You're never winning any year. You have to be ahead of the curve, not behind it. And, Jordan, that's one of those sharp plays for this season because if it hits, it could hit pretty big. Look what we saw with Vernon last year as well down there in Miami, hitting for some pretty impressive value. Ross, while we're in Miami, just something I wanted to mention, not necessarily news from this week, but news from the offseason we haven't covered yet. Koomisi is now manning the inside. He's manning the middle linebacker. It's a 3-4 base defense there in Miami. So he's manning this position, replacing Donnell Ellerbe, who hit triple-digit tackles last year, but by all accounts was pretty much a failure in an every down role in the inside there. So there's a few questions that we have. First and foremost, can Misi transfer from being a 2-down player to a 3-down player? Sounds like coaches believe he can. And then if that is the case, then where do we value Misi in terms of our linebacker ranking? So let's throw that over to you.
Yeah, well, I'm just looking at our rankings now, Jeff, and you've got Misi 43rd. I've got him 54th overall in linebackers. And, perhaps if we see in the preseason and through OTAs that they're saying he's a 3-down player, we're going to have to bump him. But for me, he's exactly that kind of boom player that you really want to be grabbing towards the end of a draft. At the minute, we've both got him as being a little bit on the irrelevant side for fantasy, down quite that low. But I would definitely he's the kind of player you've got to look to as someone who could really break out if he gets that opportunity, because we were both so high on LB in that system last year, and he massively disappointed. So if Misi can stay on the field, he could definitely have some good value as an LB3, maybe even an LB2.
Yeah, Ellerbe really struggled against the run. Ellerbe is solid enough in coverage, but struggled against the run. That's exactly where Misi excels. And we've seen games before. I go back to the early 2012. I think it was week 1 when he put up 10 solos, but it was against the Texans, right? Texans, especially then, run heavy. Arian Foster touching the ball 30, 35 times a game. So it only made sense that he was out there in that base defense and just was gobbling up the tackles. If he's out there for 3 downs, it was really intriguing. And my ranking is sort of a hedge right now. If he doesn't get the 3-down role, then sure, you can play him in some weeks where they're playing run-heavy offenses, but you're not going to want to rely on him on a weekly basis. But yeah, Ross, you're spot on. Maybe he creeps into that LB3 range if we do get wind from the preseason that he is in that every down role. So somebody to keep on your short list of players who you want to keep an eye on, who maybe your league mates aren't looking at this point in the year. Another player who
Before you move on,
probably,
Jeff, can we
all right.
chuck Reed into that category? It seems like he's a guy we always want to talk about as being a middle linebacker who could play 3 downs and stuff like that. Do you agree?
I missed the player.
Brooks Reed.
I'm not in on that one. I don't think that he is. I think he can play in the inside, in the base downs, but I really don't. I mean, I don't think he translates very well. Basically, what Hill allowed them to do is if Clowney is in an outside linebacker position in the base downs, then Clowney's going to obviously kick down to a defensive end position in the sub packages, and then Reed can sort of be that outside linebacker in the sub packages. But I just don't see the fantasy value there. For me, I'm passing on Reed this year. I know some people still have higher hopes for him, but I feel like the book's already been written on him in my situation. Now, then again, if Brian Cushing goes down with an injury again, maybe my story changes. But for now, I wouldn't actually be looking at Reed as a guy on my draft board. So what is it that you particularly like about him?
Just the potential, like you say, that he could get on the field a little bit more. He has been traditionally an outside linebacker who's going to be given some inside linebacker snaps. For me, he's a bit like Misi, a guy that's probably off most people's radars with maybe a bit more potential to get more playing time and get in the middle of the park and hit some people. So, I'm not. He's not going to be on all my rosters, but depending how I've built my roster during the draft, he could be one of those linebackers I grab really late.
So always good to have flyers at the end of drafts, and I always say it's always good to draft your defensive backs at the end of drafts. You do want to maybe get your hands on one of the elite options this year, but if you're in a league that sports a full slate of IDP starting spots, the volatility at the position is so high from year to year. But we do see certain situations that tend to produce more IDP value. And Ross, one of those situations is in Indianapolis. We do get some pretty solid production out of these Colts defensive backs because typically they've been playing behind some suspect linebackers. Of course, Antoine Bethea is now out of the mix. He's in San Francisco, which is a tough landing spot for a guy who can produce. He's not going to produce that much behind Patrick Willis, especially once Navarro Bowman comes back. But maybe early in the season we'll see some okay numbers, but it's going to be taking a step back for Bethea from an IDP standpoint. But the question is who replaces him. And early on there was some speculation that Delano Howell, who's a very athletic kid, was going to be the guy who steps up and replaces Bethea. But then we get news this past week that now it's Mike Adams who actually has the early edge for this Colts starting free safety job. Now, Ross, we've seen Adams. We've been down this road before in Denver. And I'm just kind of curious of what do you think about this? Because there certainly is potential to get some interesting upside out of whoever gets the starting job. Are you buying Adams? Are you looking more towards how are you sort of processing this whole situation?
Yeah, it is an interesting one. I mean, Mike Adams, 10-year veteran, he's never recorded over 80 total tackles in a season, and he's filling a role where Antoine Bethea had 100 total tackles in 5 of the last 6. So he has definitely been handed a role where there is production, like you mentioned. So that's of interest. But I think with Adams, even when he was in Denver last year and played and the year before, he was the kind of guy who was like a bye-week replacement. He was nearly always sitting on the waiver wire, and if you were struggling, you were carrying a really shallow bench, you could pick him up and go, yeah, he's probably going to get 5 or 6 tackles, so. And I think that I do believe he probably will be the starter this season, but I just can't get on board. I mean, I think the addition of DeQuell Jackson in the middle will gobble up a few more tackles, and I'm a Laurent Landry fan. So for me, Adams is a player I'm probably not going to see on many rosters.
Yeah, and I'm still not convinced that he wins the job outright. I mean, you can take what beat reporters say at this point of the year, and in some situations, sure, they're spot on. In other situations, hey, they may be honestly not even plugged in, so they may not know what's going on. So, take it with a grain of salt. Uh, there is value to be had there, though. If whoever wins this job, somebody to keep on your list of bye week replacements, or guys, every year we see it, we draft somebody at defensive back who ends up just completely flopping, and then other players come out of left field. So somebody to keep on your list there, either Howell or Adams, whoever wins the job. Now, in Dallas, it looks like Justin Durant is really the leader in the clubhouse to win the middle linebacker job, with Sean Lee, unfortunately, on injured reserve. And this is interesting because the Dallas offense is pretty good. The Dallas defense is pretty bad. So there's opportunity here. Figures to be a lot of shootouts. Figures to be a lot of tackle opportunities for whoever does get that every down role. And we've seen Durant in the past. We've seen him play 3 downs in the past. But do we like him? That's the question. Now, I can't see Durant being much more than an LB3, especially at this point in his career. Now getting closer to 30, will actually turn 29 in September, so right when the season starts. Ross, am I off here? Are you feeling the same thing with Durant? Do you think this guy is the next Carlos Dansby of this year, or do you think that he's squarely in that maybe LB3 or even perhaps below LB3 range?
Yeah, I'm in the LB3, below LB3 range. I will eat my hat. Not that I'm wearing a hat. If he's the next Carlos Dansby. The thing is, it's just such a muddled linebacking core. We kind of touched on it a bit previously, but McLean, Holloman, Hitchens, none of them are sexy picks. Not that they need to be sexy, they just need to score points. But I just don't see it from Durant like you. I mean, he has some value as a sleeper, but it's one of those situations where everyone is aware that the Dallas middle linebacker is going to have some fantasy value because of the dichotomy you just talked about. So everyone's got their finger on the pulse, and I just don't think it's a player you're going to slide past people. I don't think he's going to fall far enough in a draft to make me want to grab him. For me, like you said, we've seen him in Detroit have more of a role, and he never really hit big there in fantasy circles. So I'm not a buyer.
Yeah, I can't really recommend taking the risk on him. Undersized player. Admittedly not comfortable at the middle linebacker position. So I wouldn't be shocked if, he opens the season as the starter and then Dallas plays, musical chairs at the position, and we see Holloman, we see maybe McLean. The word is McLean is absolutely, and this shouldn't be a surprise, he's absolutely no lock to make the 53-man roster. So we could see a variety of things going on there, and it's one of those situations, it's kind of like when you have, a really solid RBBC, running back by committee situation that you just absolutely, like a Carolina situation with D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart, you just kind of want to avoid it altogether and let somebody else deal with that headache. That's probably what you're going to have to do with Dallas this year. Better to be safe and look for other players, Ross, like Wesley Woodyard. Wesley Woodyard is penciled in as a starter. I think we should pretty much almost ink him in as a starter at this point. This is something we've had in our rankings for months now. We knew this was coming. Once he signed there, there's nobody else there. And this coaching staff isn't entirely enamored with Zach Brown. Colin McCarthy, I'm sorry, folks, if you're still hanging on, God bless you if you're still hanging on to Colin McCarthy in dynasty leagues. But boy, that ship has set sail. And I don't know if it's ever actually going to come into port. Just not going to happen there. So move on. But Woodyard, an intriguing name, and Ross, dare I say, LB1 upside in Tennessee with this Ray Horton defense. Agree or disagree?
Jeff, you definitely may say LB1 upside. I've got him ranked number 14 at the minute. I like Woodyard. I was high on him last year when he was in Denver. He did flop thanks to the stinger and a few other issues. But for me, this is a guy who made 117 total tackles just 2 years ago. He's going to like the system. Like you say, he should be inked in, maybe permanent marketing against the guy, against Foku, Gooden. He's definitely a guy I'm very high on. I think I'm going to end up drafting him a lot. Unless the public perception catches up, he's going to be quite on many of my rosters. I'm pretty confident. And as for getting off the Colin McCarthy train, Jeff, you know I'm a massive Colin McCarthy fan, and I'm going to have to say that I agree because I actually dumped him in my recent rookie draft. He was one of the players I cut to make space for someone else. So if I'm off the McCarthy train, I think I was probably the last person on it.
Yeah, it's tough. We see this all the time. We see players who may not be the best players who go out and they put up really strong numbers, and we just kind of assume that's going to continue to happen. Pat Anger comes to mind as another player like that, and it just never materializes after that point. So that's why it's important, not to just look at the stats. Yes, we're a stats-based site, and yes, we certainly look at plenty of stats, but watch the games, watch the players. Don't just sit there on Sundays and watch Red Zone. I know Red Zone is a guilty pleasure for everybody, and maybe even not so guilty of a pleasure. But hey, Game Rewind is a great option. It depends on how diehard you are, but if you're listening to this show, you're probably pretty diehard. Go back and watch the linebackers. Watch how they play. Are they over pursuing? Are they, not getting off blocks? Like, are they good or are they not good? And you'll get a really good sense of that, especially for you folks in Dynasty leagues who you want to target. Now, Ross, a name that has come up in Dynasty circles, a rookie in Buffalo, also came up in the news this week. So I wanted to go back to this Kiko Alonso story because news broke that from Buffalo News that the Bills were actually looking to Preston Brown, the third-round pick, to replace Kiko Alonso. Now, this seems very loaded, right? Because there's this general assumption, okay, well, then he's just going to replace him, and then all of a sudden he's got basically Kiko Alonso's opportunities, and maybe he's not going to match his production, but he'll produce a lot. I don't know if I'm buying that. I'm looking at this a little bit closer. Does this mean replace Kiko Alonso, or does this mean replace Kiko Alonso in the sub-packages? Because remember, we talked about this last week. There's a lot of options for what the Bills can potentially do. We know Brandon Spikes is going to be in the base package. We're almost certain Keith Rivers is going to be out there. But then do they do something like have Nigel Bradham out there in the base packages, a great run stopper and really a solid asset to have out there on the field, and then rotate Brown in the sub packages and potentially use either Spikes or Rivers? The moral of the story here is we don't know. And so don't get too carried away. Just because some websites, some news site said Preston Brown's replacing him, it may not mean what we think it means. So proceed with caution here. Ross, thoughts on this Buffalo situation?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you, Jeff. Don't want to sound like a parrot, but I mean everything you said rings true for me. This guy was drafted in the third round, so this is someone they've got their eye on. I mean, sometimes it's difficult for me talking about college players. Obviously, I don't have such great access to college football as you guys do in the States, but from what I can tell, he sounds like he's a bit of a downhill thumper, and that sounds quite different to Alonso. From when I saw Alonso play, I felt he's a sideline to sideline player. He's speedy, so. If he ends up being more of a clone of Brandon Spikes, does he have a three-down role? And like you say, the possibility of the big nickel and all this kind of stuff, using three safeties because of the talent they have there in Buffalo. I think that Preston Brown is a player that has some interest in rookie drafts, but there's plenty of other linebackers I would like before. And there's no obvious, you can't, I don't think we've read the tea leaves correctly yet. We need a bit more information from camp and then from the preseason before we can really put a definitive value on this guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And in rookie drafts too, when it came for the point for guys like Brown to go off the board, I was drafting offensive talent, right? There were certain players that you wanted to target this year. If you really wanted to get Mosley, then go and get Mosley. You're going to have to spend a somewhat early pick on him, and some people are a little reluctant to do that. But Easley was probably the biggest target for me because he's equivalent to Aaron Donald. He's just coming off an ACL, and he's going to be ready for this season, folks. So I think he's an absolute steal. But getting those guys, Telvin Smith, Christian Kirksey, Khalil Mack, even Shazier and Mosley are going a little bit before them. But getting those guys, that's your sort of sweet spot, as opposed to where Brown's going. You can get some great value at the running back position, guys like Storm Johnson or some players in that area, as opposed to taking that pick and using it on IDP when you can actually probably fill your IDP roster later on with waiver picks anyway. So Definitely agree with you there. Ross, one more piece of news before we get to the subject of the day. And that has to deal with Dayton Jones going back to last year, draft pick for the Packers. And Jones is being pegged as a potential breakout candidate. My ears perked up on this one because it wasn't long ago, maybe a month and a half, that Mike Daniels was being pegged as a breakout candidate. So we have Daniels and Jones, both on that Packers defensive line, pegged as breakout candidates. Plus, we have Julius Peppers, who is going to play a sort of hybrid elephant role. Who maybe he'll be, at the outside linebacker position at times, but he's going to have his hand in the dirt quite frequently. So, and we know this is a 3-4 defense, so it's got to be somebody, and somebody's going to see more snaps. So I'm going to throw this out to you, Ross. If you had to pick, who are you going with, Jones or Daniels as the guy to like in Green Bay, or do you just throw them both out and say I don't like either of them?
No, I'm definitely taking Jones, Jeff. I mean, as I mentioned a bit earlier, I wasn't that high on Dion Jordan when he came out last year, who was normally universally the number one defensive end, or at least pass rusher on most people's boards. So I had to have someone there. And the people I had at the top was Demontre Moore, who we've obviously covered in some of our writing and other podcasts. And then Dayton Jones. He was a guy I really liked. I liked his potential and his size. But obviously landing in a 3-4 system in Green Bay is hardly ideal. I think if you look at him, he only played 13% of snaps last year, so there's definitely some question marks over, what his productivity will be over a sustained period. But, raw ability of what I've seen, I do like him, and he would be my choice in Green Bay out of the two you offered.
Yeah, and I'm going to go the other direction. It's good to have a little disagreement here, but
Finally,
for
we
me,
disagree, Jeff. It's a landmark moment.
I really like what I saw out of Daniels last year. Uh, Maybe arguably pound for pound, aside from J.J. Watt and guys like that, he was really one of the best pass rushing 3-4 defensive ends in the league last year. He's right up there with Calais Campbell, with Cameron Jordan, and yet he didn't play the snaps they did. He only played about 50% of the defensive snaps. So if we see that number creep into the 70% range, in the past the wisdom was always, hey, stay away from 3-4 defensive ends. Well, that whole mold in fantasy leagues has been shattered with players like who I just mentioned and several others. Daniels has an intriguing sack ceiling. When was the last time we really saw that fantasy relevant defensive end there in Green Bay? But it could happen this year, and I understand the hype with Jones, and I understand Jones is a really impressive player. But my concern is ultimately going to boil down to snaps. Is he going to get 70%, 75%, or is he going to get more like 40 to 50%? And that's really where I'm projecting him right now, whereas I have Daniels creeping into the 70% range. For me, that volume is what takes it over the top. Yeah, he doesn't have a massive tackle ceiling, but then again, how many defensive ends actually do? You're not going to see Chandler Jones-like production out of most players. But for me, I'm leaning Daniels. I'm going to, take a long look at him in that DL3 range because I do love that ceiling he offers. And Ross, this is sort of a perfect transition because Daniels is a player who I look at as an ascending player, and maybe you feel the same way about Jones. But this is the time of year when we really start to take a close look at which players are rising and which players are sort of falling. Who's on the upslope of their career and about to break out in an IDP fashion, and who are former IDP, maybe stars, or even role players who really should be off our radar for this year. So I'm going to throw the ball in your court to start things off. And why don't you go ahead and give me, your top risers in one at a time, I guess. So who's your top risers entering 2014 IDP risers?
Okay, well, I've already touched on my love of Wesley Woodyard. I mean, maybe a little bit hollow as a riser, but I've got him at number 14 at the minute. The fact that this was a guy who was being dropped in fantasy football from rosters last year at the end of last season, he was on the rubbish pile. But, this move's going to invigorate him, and I think he's got plenty of potential in Tennessee. Another guy I really like, and this one feels strange to talk about, is Paul Warrilow. Currently, I've got him as my number 13, so back to back with Woodyard. You've got him at 10, I see, Jeff. The reason I'm saying Warrilow is just because we cast a lot of aspersions over his production last year. We said, be really careful about this guy coming forward. But then you say Weatherspoon's now injured; he's out for the season, so that affects him directly in Atlanta. And then look at the talent in the LB1 core. Sean Lee's out, Kiko Alonso's out, Darrell Washington's out. You've got both Gerard Mayo and Brian Cushing returning from injury. Von Miller's returning from injury, and then I would argue that James Laurinaitis is going backwards. So that's so many players in that kind of LB1 tier that either aren't in it or have some question marks of some sort. I do believe in Mayo and Cushing, and Von Miller, but you have to say coming off injuries, you have to be at least somewhat wary. So Warrillow's gone from being like a back end LB2 who I was a little bit hesitant about to a guy that I think is really moving towards that LB1 status. And then the last one we talked, a little bit like how we talked about the Indianapolis strong safety spot is being great for production. So is the Cleveland strong safety spot, or it has been at times. So Dante Whitner moving there isn't of interest. I mean, we're going back maybe longer than you'd like. It was saying 4 years ago, 2010. This is a guy who had 139 total tackles. He can be productive if he's in the right place. He's coming away from San Francisco, where Bethea is going to end up. Who we're going to see how Bethea's tackles are going to fall off a cliff now. So Whitner's just a guy. I'm just questioning whether he has some value in that system, especially with shaky linebackers in front of him.
Yeah, we've seen him put up some big numbers in his time in Buffalo, so would not be shocked at all to see him emerge as a DB1 this season. Now, I'm maybe digging a little bit deeper. I certainly agree with you with Woodyard, obviously with Warrilow. Not sure where everybody else has him in the industry, but I wouldn't be surprised if I'm the highest ranked on him. But I'm going to go a little bit deeper. And the player I mentioned earlier, Jamie Collins for the Patriots, flashed in the playoffs last year after really sort of playing a situational role in his rookie season. But what's really impressive about Collins is his ability to do everything. At his size, he can cover. He looks extremely comfortable in coverage. He made a few plays last year, and go back and watch those playoff games, especially the Patriots' first playoff game, where just out loud, wow! Like, how did that guy do that at that size? Plus, he has the added sack presence, and he plays in a very favorable home venue. I expect him to emerge as an every down player. And I expect him to be, if not one of perhaps the biggest IDP breakout of 2014. I'm also looking at Emmanuel Lamore. Ross, we both got a question on Twitter about Lamore. You were hesitant, and I was all in. I'm pushing the chips in on this guy. This guy reminds me, and he has drawn comparisons to Cam Chancellor, but he's a linebacker, so he's got that speed to cover. He's freakishly big for the are we seeing a pattern here, right? We're seeing this pattern with wide receivers, bigger wide receivers, faster wide receivers. We're seeing this with these linebackers now who for massive size can actually still cover. And what we saw last year too in Cincinnati is there's a high let's say a high ceiling for tackles because Vincent Ray went out and sort of lit it up in the few games that he started. I think Lamore can do that. I think he's a much better option than Ray Malaluga in the sub packages, and Lamore is a guy who probably will go undrafted in most leagues, so keep him on your list of players to watch. At defensive end, real quick, since we really didn't give any love to our defensive end guys, two players who've been getting some buzz as risers this offseason, Everson Griffin and Jerry Hughes. Griffin stepping in for essentially Jared Allen, moving into now probably close to an every down role. Allen played over 1,000 snaps in the last 3 seasons, each of the last 3 seasons. So Griffin should have much more opportunity. He's flashed as a great pass rusher at times. So putting that all together, that's a sneakier guy who you can get DL2 value out of later on in your draft. Hughes, we mentioned last week, high sack ceiling. Performed a lot better than a lot of people realized last year, but his tackle floor is pretty low as well in that wide 9 system for Jim Schwartz. Now, my guys, my risers, I got 2 risers at the defensive back position. T.J. McDonald, Ross, I know you could talk about McDonald for an entire show, but he's in a great situation, sophomore season, in a solo tackle friendly environment. So he's not going to rack up a lot of assists, but his solo tackle totals should be really high playing there in St. Louis. And the other player is Mike Mitchell. Now, Mike Mitchell, skill standpoint, maybe not necessarily up there with elite level, but you don't need to be the most skilled player to produce fantasy value. So he's stepping in for Ryan Clark, very likely going to be the starter. Doesn't look like Shamarko Thomas is going to be ready just yet, and he's probably more the long-term solution for Troy Polamalu once he ends his career. So Mitchell showed some athletic ability now he's in a position where he can produce. He's going to be a really sneaky player who I have my eye on. But Ross, where there are ups, there are also downs. So which players do you have on the downslope, the fallers of the IDP world?
Just a quick comment on Mitchell. I mentioned I've just finished a rookie draft, but it's also a draft you can take veterans in. And one of the teams released Mitchell during the draft. And I had a quick look at our rankings and saw that he was creeping up yours, so I grabbed him at the end of the 8th round as a player. I thought definitely had some value compared to the rookies that were around at that point. So yeah, Mitchell is a guy who I'm sneakily eyeing up a little bit too. But on to my fallers. The first guy I want to mention is Jarrell Casey. Now this is a guy who really exploded last year, double-digit tackles. But the change of system to a 3-4 and the fact it just worries me a lot. You know, Darnell Dockett wasn't successful in that system either, really, from a fantasy perspective. So he was a guy who got lots of hype towards the end of last season, and I think probably was going to get hyped up a bit this season, but we've both got him right at the tail end of our DE2. You've actually got him as a DE3 at number 27. I've got him 24. So he's a guy I'm lower on than maybe quite a few. Another guy who I think I'm going to have to class as a faller is DeQuell Jackson. Now, this is a guy who only a few seasons ago was a lock LB1. I mean, there was even talk that he was the #1 linebacker in fantasy football, and now he is literally right at the bottom of our LB2 tier. We've both got him ranked 22. He's moving to Indianapolis. He's going to be sharing time with Jarrell Freeman, so he's no longer going to be the main tackle guy in the middle. He's got shared responsibilities there. So for me, he's a massive faller and not someone I'm expecting to own in too many leagues. And the final guy I want to mention as a faller, and I feel kind of mean about it, is Earl Thomas, mainly because he gets so much press, and he is one of the very, very best safeties playing the game right now. He had a phenomenal stretch last year where he was a serious fantasy player. You know, he'd gone from the season before being like one of those kind of DB2 guys you were never sure quite what he was going to do, a little bit inconsistent, more of a turnover guy. Now he has rectified that and put himself in that kind of DB1 tier. I've got 13 guys in front of him. He's my number 14, and I feel pretty good about at least 10 of those guys. You've got him 11th, so you think at least 10 guys are going to score more fantasy points than him this year, and I wouldn't disagree. But on name value alone, he's probably going to go too high. So just for that reason alone, I'm going to say Earl Thomas is a faller.
Yeah, take a close look at his production once Bobby Wagner came back in full force and the production goes down. Hey, and good players on great defenses don't often bode positively for fantasy value. So I'd have to agree with you there. Don't overvalue Earl Thomas. Now, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, and I know this one is a little bit of a controversial take, but I am looking at DeAndre Levy as a faller, and this is kind of a shocker, a top 10 guy last year. A lot of people loved this guy. Hey, he was one of those players who sort of came out of nowhere. People picked him up. I mean, we knew about him, but he just didn't get that opportunity to play an every down role when Durant was there because they were sort of rotating in the sub packages along with Tulloch. So last year, he's there. He's in a perfect defense for a weak side linebacker. That Schwartz defense funnels everything to the weak side linebacker. Yes, that's another reason to be depressed about Kiko Alonso, but he had 6 interceptions, guys. It's not happening again. There's no way he repeats that. And his tackle ceiling is not an enormous tackle ceiling. Yeah, he'll probably get in the range of triple digits, but I don't see him going much over 120 total tackles. It's just not enough. I have him back. Actually, I probably have him outside of my LB3s just to make a point. But really, back end of the LB3s is where I'm comfortable with him. If I'm taking somebody in Detroit, it's Tulloch. It's not close. We mentioned Donnell Ellerbe, too. He's another player who's dropping down significantly. Misi in the middle. Don't draft Ellerbe. I don't have him ranked even. At defensive end, OC Umenyiora, love this guy for his strip sack ability, but do not love his situation. We're looking at a potentially transitioning defense to a 3-4. He's not going to get the snaps this year. Downgrade him significantly. And then also Chris Clemens. Going to Jacksonville initially looked like an interesting fit with his former coach, Gus Bradley, to play that Leo, the left end outside rusher. But then we're getting word that Andre Branch, the much younger Andre Branch, what is Andre Branch, about 10 years younger than Clemens, is getting a shot. And Branch is a guy 2 years ago in rookie drafts who we really liked. But we see this, this sort of age-old adage of wide receivers taking the leap in the third year. Well, we could really apply that. Maybe we don't apply that to the wide receivers now. We're seeing other Keenan Allens of the world who that doesn't apply to. But for defensive ends, a lot of times it does. There's a steep learning curve for the defensive ends. So potentially we see Branch make the leap this year. Now, I'm not saying he necessarily does, but I'm saying we certainly have to downgrade Clemens as a result. At the defensive back position, I'm downgrading Charles Woodson. He's ageless, yes, but eventually Father Time catches up with everyone. See Fletcher, London for an example of that. And last, certainly not least, perhaps the player in all history who Ross and I disagree about the most, Jairus Byrd, is downgraded
that's
in
Patrick
New Orleans.
Chung. Patrick Chung's the guy we disagree the most about.
That was like one thing, but the Bird thing, that was like a month or so of a time. The Bird thing we've disagreed about this for the last 3 years.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Basically, he's the poster child for regression to the mean. He had a monster 2011 season, 98 total tackles, 3 picks, 3 forced fumbles, a sack, a touchdown, huge numbers, DB1 numbers. Since then, he hasn't been able to match those numbers. He's been a DB3. Even when he came back last year, yes, he's great on the field. Don't get me wrong. He's fantastic on the field, but he's not a fantastic IDP option. And now he's in New Orleans, which if you read my column on home stats crews, New Orleans is the worst home stat crew for IDPs. They give out the least tackles in the league. Buffalo gives out the most, New Orleans the least. So a guy who already doesn't record a lot of tackles and didn't do so in Buffalo is going to really have a tough time putting up big fantasy numbers. I think he's still a DB3. Yeah, he could have opportunity for some big plays, interceptions, but you don't want to rely on that going into the season. So Jairus Byrd moving down in my ranks. Ross, any closing thoughts for this week?
No, you say what you want about Jairus Byrd. I'm not as high as I have been on him previously, but hey, you're the defending most accurate IDP ranker in the nation, Jeff. So if you say Bird's not as good, we're going to have to take your word for it.
I think it's 2-time defending, but only my mom cares about that. Anyway, for this week, that's going to do it. We'll be back next week with some more IDP talk. So for Pro Football Focus, he's Ross Miles. I'm Jeff Ratcliffe. That's a wrap.